Good morning, everybody. I'm Karen Kier. I'm the communications editor for the Nebraska Museums Association. And I want to welcome you to June's monthly museum musings. We are fortunate enough to have Michael Sothen, sorry, and Kelly Bacon from the Historic Preservation Office here in Nebraska. And they're going to talk to us about how historic preservation, SHPO can help benefit your museum. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly and Michael.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Give just a second here. I just want to make sure. So what you can see on your screen, can you just see the one screen? Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Okay. We're just, depending on what mode you have your PowerPoint in. So, hi, everybody. I am Kelly Bacon. I am the Certified Local Government Outreach and Easement Coordinator in the Nebraska State Historic Preservation Office at the Nebraska State Historical Society. And I am here with Michael. Michael, I'll let you introduce yourself real quick before we go into the PowerPoint.
Yeah, my name is Michael Sothen, and I am the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. So yeah, we're two of the preservation staff here with the state of Nebraska.
Yep. Okay. And there we go. Okay. So who is SHPO? So we are the State Historic Preservation Office. There is, in Nebraska, we're a division of the Nebraska State Historical Society. There is a State Historic Preservation Office in every state and territory in the country. A lot of them are housed within their state's historical society, but another common area is with economic development or like their version of game and parks, Department of Natural Resources, that sort of thing. So we carry out federal programs in Nebraska that are administered by the National Park Service, which is a division of the Department of the Interior. So the federal programs that we carry out are survey, and that's for standing structures, buildings, bridges, that sort of thing, and archaeological sites. And survey is when we're looking for things that we would consider historic. And I don't just mean old. I'll explain kind of what we mean in a future slide here. But we kind of say like capital H historic and not just, lowercase historic just because it's old sort of thing. The National Register of Historic Places, which is a program that the public, if you're most familiar with your office, it's probably because of the National Register. Historic tax incentives, Section 106 review and compliance. And again, this is for buildings and bridges, that sort of thing, and for archaeological sites, and certified local governments. And we'll get into more what all of those are in just a little bit. And we also carry out state preservation duties that are in state legislation. And so that's state building project review. And that's so anytime there's state funding that would maybe affect a state building, then our office would review it. State funded project review. So if there's state funding that might affect a non-state owned building across the state, our office would review that. And then the historic marker program, which is also a very popular, well-known program that our office administers. We also have historic preservation easements and covenants, and I'll get into what those are in a little bit. But we're also a resource for the public. So if you have, questions about, you're an old building that maybe you own or your family owns, or you're concerned about something or want to know how to properly care for it, definitely feel free to contact us. We will, help you the best we can, or find somebody else who may, have better answers than us. But yeah, we really work with, preservation, the actual, taking care of properties, but long range planning and economic development through using historic resources.
Real quick, I know, Kelly, yes. I'm sure that a lot of folks with their museums, especially if you're at a county historical society or something like that, you probably get questions from the public pretty often that say, right. Hey, I've got this historic building, or maybe it's on the National Register. What does that mean? I want it to be on the National Register, things like that. And if you don't have those answers, that's okay. But know that you can direct them to us, and we're happy to try to take some of those inquiries.
Yeah. And also think something to note too, that, we try to help the public with the information that we have in our office, but a lot of times there's better information that you can find locally. So don't be surprised if, you're contacted, by somebody that we say that, hey, we've got a little bit of information, but it'd be really great if you contacted, your county historical society, your county museum, that sort of thing. So now I'm going to talk about the National Register of Historic Places. So what is the National Register? It's our nation's list of properties that are worthy of preservation. So it is part of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. That kind of governs, that's the federal legislation that I mentioned, the federal programs that our office administers. They can have local, state, or national significance. So local significance is, it's important to your community or county, but there isn't a lot of, connections maybe to the state or the, country as a whole. And then state is, it's an important resource for the state's history, and the national for the national history. Building, structures, object sites, and districts can all be listed. So buildings are, well, pretty obvious: church, school, house, those sorts of things. Structures are things like bridges, dams, corn cribs, windmills, things that aren't designed for human occupation. So a corn crib, you could argue, well, it's a building. Well, for the National Register, it's a structure because it's designed for corn storage, not for people to occupy the inside of the building, either, living there or working there. Objects are things like fountains, monuments, sculptures. Sites are trails, campsites, cemeteries, roads, that sort of thing. And districts are groups of the above mentioned things. So groups of buildings. So it could be a downtown commercial district. It could be a residential neighborhood, that sort of thing. The National Register does not place restrictions on property owners just in and of itself. But it also does not provide for protections for properties either. Any sort of local restrictions or protections would come from like local ordinance, or we're going to talk about easements later on. The National Register in and of itself does not provide any restrictions or protections. It's just an honorary list, but there are benefits that we will get into.
And just to add to that, if I can, Kelly, and I think this is a point of confusion for a lot of folks that we hear a lot of times. And when we do have, and we'll talk about, like, I think you've already mentioned it, Kelly, the Section 106 duties, which are reviewing any federal undertaking. So if there are federal dollars involved, then sometimes there are restrictions with properties, whether they're on the National Register or not, so long as they are eligible, which we'll be talking about here. That makes that fairly clear. And so I think that sometimes creates some confusion, but whether a property is on the National Register or it's just eligible to be on the National Register, it's going to come with some restrictions when it comes to the use of federal and sometimes state funding. But by itself, just because it's on the National Register, does not bring any additional restrictions that aren't already there just because of its age or condition. So
right. Yep. Yeah. People can still use their own, or, as a museum, you could use, if you're a county historical society, use, county funding, or, donations from people, that sort of thing. You can still use that without, us having to review it or anything like that. So what makes something eligible? And there are a lot of museum buildings across the state that are listed in the National Register. So what makes something eligible? So the resource, whatever it is, has to have both significance and integrity. So what is significance? So we kind of look at it as, what story does this building or bridge or archaeological site, what story does it tell? Is it associated with an event in history like commerce or education, ethnic history, anything like that? That goes under criterion A. Is it associated with a significant individual or group of individuals? And that's criterion B. Is it a good example of an architectural style or engineering method? And that's criterion C. So this is sort of the it looks pretty sort of thing, and it's a good representative example of its style. Does it have the potential to yield further information? And this is typically where archaeological sites are listed. You can list buildings under that though, but it's rare. And for significance, you just need to meet one of those criterion, but you can meet multiple if, but you just need to meet one. For integrity, can that resource still tell its story? So I like to look at it if, somebody from the time period that that building was built, if they came and looked at it today, would they still recognize it as the building that they knew when it was built? That, understanding that, things change over time. Of course, we don't mean that things have to, be frozen in time and have had no updates whatsoever. But what have been those updates to the resource, and have they used, maybe similar materials, or if there's additions to a building, where are those additions? That sort of thing. So, and I think one thing that I have here to note is if it's a religious property, if the building has been moved, if it's a birthplace or a grave, it's a cemetery, if it's been reconstructed, if it's a commemorative property, or if it's less than 50 years old, those properties can still be eligible for listing. That, we have, cemeteries, and there's churches that are listed in the National Register. They just need some extra justification. So preservation incentive programs. I'll let Michael take over right now. So just let me know when you want me to switch the slides.
Thank you, Kelly. So I'm sure a question that a lot of you guys have, and certainly members of the public, if you interact with them, may have, whether it's buildings that are by your museum or just community buildings, are there financial resources? Everyone wants to know, how can I fix up these older historic properties, and is there money available, whether that's grants or other types of incentives? And our office predominantly deals with incentive programs. And so that's what we're going to share here. And I'll try to mention a little bit about grants later. So we have three main programs. There is a federal and state income tax-based program. And there's also our VIP, which is a valuation incentive program, which is property tax based. And you may wonder, if you're a nonprofit, how can I utilize things if I'm not necessarily paying property tax and not necessarily paying income tax? There are some ways that even nonprofit entities can use these programs. So key considerations. The biggest thing that we always want to tell people is that you really need to talk to us, and in most cases apply for these incentive programs before you start work. Because, at least according to our state programs, once you've started substantial work, it's too late. You cannot go back and then apply to get assistance from that work that you've already started. These properties do need to have historical designation, whether that's listed to the National Register of Historic Places, or they are a local landmark, which we'll talk a little bit more about here going forward. And oftentimes people feel like there's a lot of rules and restrictions with these programs, and that those can sometimes be barriers. In reality, we really are trying to work with you guys to make sure these are a successful project, but the projects need to be preservation in their intent. And so we try to work with you to find compromise and ways that make this work. We are not trying to have a building preserved exactly how it was when it was first built. We understand these buildings are going to change, that they're going to adapt. Their use may be totally different. Your museum location may be in a former depot. It's no longer a train depot, which necessitates quite a few changes. That's okay. We'll work with you. Or if it's a downtown commercial building, we know it's not going to be the same as it was when it was built in 1900. It's now got to serve that new business in a different way. So we're going to go to the next slide. So as far as those three major programs, the one that often does the heavy lifting for commercial type activities is the federal historic tax credit. So this can be used on commercial or other income producing properties, where you can get a 20% tax credit on eligible expenses. And I'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that's key to the federal tax credit is there are no per project caps, and that you'll understand more once we talk about our state tax credit. But here, this must be an income producing property. So that's typically going to be your traditional commercial properties, maybe rental housing. But we will say there are creative ways for nonprofits, such as museums or other entities, to create for-profit entities and be able to fully capture and utilize these federal historic tax credits. There's been some examples even within Nebraska where entities have done that. Maybe it's putting the property into an LLC, and that LLC could be a subsidiary of the nonprofit, but it's able to have a different tax structure to be able to claim these types of credits. Since these are income tax credits, they do go against tax liabilities. So that can sometimes be a challenge for museums. Although, again, this is where we always say, talk to a tax professional, a CPA, because there are creative ways that you can bring in equity partners and other different things. But even if you, as a museum, cannot use these are likely going to be options for people in your community, other historic properties that you may be involved in trying to save. And these tax credits can be quite helpful. Now, what are you getting a credit for? I'm going to go ahead and talk about that right now. These tax credits can be used on a variety of activities from a building, everything from maybe it's a roof repair, replacement, maybe it's tuck pointing or fixing issues with wooden siding or other different exterior materials. It's doing some foundation work, perhaps replacement of windows, but most definitely repair of windows and other different things on the exterior of the building. Once we get on the inside, it's going to be everything from paint to flooring to walls, light fixtures, plumbing, some plumbing fixtures, and a variety of different things on the interior. Sometimes it's almost easier if we talk about what's not included. So if you're needing to do a parking lot renovation outside, that parking lot renovation is not going to be an eligible expense. You're doing new landscaping, working on the sidewalk. Most likely those things will not be eligible expenses. However, sometimes ADA ramps may qualify. If you've got a building that's got multiple floors and you're putting in an elevator, oftentimes that will be a qualifying expense. Inside a building, things that don't qualify are going to be things that are easily removed. So area rugs, furnishings, so like desks, things like that. If you've got a commercial kitchen or like a little area, well, the appliances aren't going to count. You know, if there's a microwave and a stove and maybe a sink that's more of that commercial style that can easily be detached and removed, those types of things are not eligible expenses, but most other things are, including hiring an architect, hiring a tax professional, hiring an engineer, any sort of professional services that are needed to help get a project going. Those things are also eligible and would be able to be claimed for a tax credit. For the federal historic tax credit, the property must be on the National Register of Historic Places or contributing to a National Register historic district. We'll go to the next slide, Kelly. So a companion tool to this, or can be used independently, is the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit. This is also an income tax-based credit that was created in 2015, was recently reauthorized in 2023. For most of our counties, this is a 30% credit. In Douglas, Sarpy, and we should also add Lancaster County, it is a 25% credit. So it's only 25% in our more urban counties, but 30% throughout the rest of the state. Again, that goes on those eligible expenses. The same principles applied on what is an eligible expense. The state tax credit, unlike the federal one, has a project cap. So you can only get $2 million in credits. Now, I'm trying to think, I think that's around a $7 million project. So if you're spending more than $7 million, you're going to run into this cap. By and large, most projects are probably going to be under that unless these are larger institutions or properties, right? So that's just something to be aware of. Something that provides more flexibility, the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit works for buildings that are already listed to the National Register of Historic Places, or those that are locally landmarked. And you may ask, what's a local landmark? Well, communities can pass what's called a historic preservation ordinance. They have to do that in compliance with our office standards, but they can then declare properties within their jurisdiction to be historic through a local landmark in this preservation ordinance. And so if people have questions about that, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it is a possibility where communities can have a role to play in what's considered to be historic within their own community. And certainly if those don't rise to the level of inclusion to the National Register of Historic Places. And so that's something to be aware of. I think right now we currently have around 12 or 13 communities statewide that have allowed themselves this tool to declare things locally historic. For the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit, these properties should be income producing, but it also works for nonprofits and local government properties. So this may be like a county courthouse, a city auditorium. Those properties can apply for this state tax credit. Same with a museum that's a nonprofit, or other different entities that may be owned, like such as a church. Things like that can apply to use this type of tax credit. How does that work? In this case, you don't have to change your legal status, because a nonprofit or a local government can sell the tax credits. These are transferable credits. And so if me and a board are part of a management of a local museum, and we've got to do renovations on our buildings, if we obtain at the end of the project, let's say $250,000 worth of credits, we can then sell those credits. They're often sold for a discount, usually somewhere between 80 and 90 cents on the dollar. But it's a way to then generate funds that can help pay back loans or repopulate a capital improvement fund or things like that. And so we do try to provide some flexibility to this program. This program, the only type of property that's not eligible for this credit are owner-occupied houses. So if the house is owner-occupied, it's not going to be eligible for this program. However, a lot of properties within Nebraska certainly can use this, whether that's, again, a property in your downtown area, the local church, the city auditorium, the county courthouse, your own museum property. There may be ways that it can utilize this program to get a 30%, or depending upon that location, 25% credit to cover some of the expenses of that renovation. We're going to go to the next slide. So our third major program is called the Valuation Incentive Program. We call it VIP. So this is a freeze of property valuation for 8 years following the rehab. And that's assuming that you spend, and I should have probably mentioned the eligibility for those other programs. For the state historic tax credit, you have to spend at least $5,000, pretty low bar. For the federal historic tax credit, they have a rule in there that you have to meet a certain percentage of an adjusted base income. That's kind of similar to what this valuation incentive program is, where the renovations you're doing have to exceed 25% of the assessed value of the property. And if it doesn't have an assessed value, we have to work with you to try to determine, what that value may be. But you get 8 years where that's frozen at that pre-project rehab valuation. And then you get an additional 4 years where it slowly stair steps up. So you get 12 years of benefit of the valuation incentive program. Now, to qualify for this tool, a property must be listed on the National Register or be locally landmarked, like we were talking about before. And this is available for property types such as single-family homes. It's our only incentive program that can be used for historic owner-occupied dwelling, but it can also be used for commercial properties. That's what it's mainly used for. But unfortunately, it cannot be used by local governments or nonprofits unless you're paying property taxes. Occasionally, a local government or nonprofit has a property that's subject to property tax. It can be used on those, but if it's not subject to property tax, this program is not going to have any benefits for the end user. So again, those are some things to try to keep in mind there. Again, this is a property tax program, so it's a program where the state then works with the county assessor to ensure that this is upheld. So that's a little bit about our three major programs. Kelly, let's go and go to the next slide. And I think, okay, so here's one of our examples. So some of you guys are familiar with the Willa Cather Foundation. They are a variety of different services that they provide, but certainly within that museum world, this is an example of the moon block, which is where their foundation and their exhibits predominantly are located. You can see what it looked like pre-rehab and what it looks like today. They've continued to fully utilize this building, and it's now being used on both the first and second floor in its entirety. So you can really get a sense of it. This is a project that I believe, and I'd have to go back and make sure that I'm right, but I think it utilized all three of these programs through its different creative means. So it used the federal, the state, and the valuation incentive program. I will say that our office occasionally has other programs that can be used on properties such as these, where it may be that we can occasionally provide a little bit of grant funding. We'll talk about it here at the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, our funding levels for those types of things have been severely impacted by what's going on the political sphere as far as what's being made available. And there are other sources for incentives out there that may be separate from the State Historic Preservation Office, such as things through the National Trust. There are occasionally some programs you can apply for through the National Park Service that are competitive grants and other things. If you ever have questions about those, feel free to reach out. We'll try to provide you some information, but you may be able to locate some sources for other incentives or grant base that's outside of our office. But here's a nice example of a museum utilizing all three of these programs, but you can also easily imagine a regular mom and pop business within your community or another developer that just wants to invest in your community. This is potentially the result that can happen when preservation's used. So we'll go and go to the next slide. And we'll turn it back over to Kelly.
Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about historic preservation easements. Oh, I didn't realize I was muted. Sorry about that. So what are historic preservation easements? They are also known as covenants. So they're really kind of the same thing. It just depends on what the document says. But they are legal agreements affecting future changes to the exterior and, depending how they're written, certain interior features. It certainly would not include every single interior feature, just the most important historic ones. And this is a way to actually protect your property if that is what you are interested in. So changes will need to be reviewed by whoever the grantee is. So if each easement has a grantor and a grantee, and the grantor is typically the entity that owns the easement, and they are granting it to another entity who would then have responsibilities for the easement. And that would be by doing annual site visits and making sure that the property owner or occupant of the building is upholding conditions in the easement. A lot of them are permanent, but some are only for a certain number of years and are subject to an end date. Permanent easements can be used as a financing tool if the property is then worth less, its assessed value is worth less. That can be taken as a tax deduction with the IRS. But you should definitely work with a tax attorney and accountant if you're trying to find some creative financing ways to fund a rehab project on your museum or another building in town. Properties must be appraised by a qualifying appraiser, and those qualifications are set by the IRS. One thing to note, though, if you are looking into something like this, it seems like from what I've heard from other states and their easement programs, and people have done this, the IRS will audit you, when you are taking this deduction. So just be aware of that. That's being as a possibility. Sometimes, why do people put, easements on buildings? Sometimes it's just because they do want to protect the property in perpetuity. But sometimes it could be a condition of grant funding. So there are several museums across the state that have gotten funding through the Save America's Treasures grant that's offered by the National Park Service. The Durham Museum in Omaha is currently working on one, but the Willa Cather Foundation recently finished one for the Willa Cather Childhood Home at Red Cloud, and the Dr. Susan LaFleche Bacot Hospital up in Walt Hill. While not entirely a museum, there is a museum component to it. Those three buildings all have easements on them because of the Save America's Treasures grant, and those are only for a period of years. So once the term ends, then property owners can do whatever they want to the building, unless it's subject to other review or something like that. But this can be a powerful tool if you are interested in protecting property. And we in our office manage almost 36 easements. And if you do want to have another entity as the grantee, it does need to be a qualifying organization that is able to uphold the conditions of the grant, of the easement. So you can't just say, oh, my neighbor here is going to be the grantee, because they're probably not a qualifying organization and able to review the building. So next, I'm going to talk about certified local governments, or CLG is the acronym. So I'll probably use that. So it's a historic preservation assistance program for local governments, and that could be villages, cities, or counties. So it sustains and builds strong communities using historic preservation principles. It identifies and supports each community's unique history. It fosters community pride, economic and community development opportunities, and long-range planning. It supports Main Street revitalization, neighborhood renewal, heritage tourism, which is popular all across the country, and using historic buildings for businesses and housing. And you may think, well, what does this have to do with museums? Museums can be a great tool in helping a community research its history, and when were buildings built, who used them, what businesses were in there. So you can have a great background effort to this program. Currently, Nebraska has 11 CLGs, and so they are listed here on the map. Communities are always welcome, to join the program. There's no limit on how many we can have or anything like that. I'm always happy to talk to local governments or groups of people in a community about the program if you'd like to learn in more detail. So there are 5 basic requirements for the program. The first is passing a preservation ordinance that Michael talked about. And that ordinance, I think, is a really powerful tool for the community, because then you are potentially opening up tax incentive possibilities for your property owners, for your museum, local businesses, homeowners, that sort of thing. That ordinance also establishes a historic preservation commission or historic preservation board, and that is a minimum of 5 people who have an interest or expertise in some area of historic preservation. And there's a larger list of what backgrounds those could be, but a lot of times people who work in their local museums have great knowledge of the community and its history. So people who are on museum boards or members, that sort of thing, can oftentimes be great commission members. And I think that's another way that museums can work with the community on programs like this. The third requirement is survey, and like I mentioned at the very beginning, that's looking for resources that would potentially be eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. But as far as the CLG program goes, it's also looking for properties that could also be eligible for your local landmarking process. The fourth requirement is that there needs to be some sort of public participation or public education as part of the program, and museums are great at public participation and public education. But the commission is required to have at least 4 meetings a year, and those meetings are subject to the open meetings law in Nebraska because they are an official public body, just like a village board or a city council, planning commission, that sort of thing. So by holding the meetings, you're meeting that. But museums can, again, be great resources to help with public education for the program. And then the fifth is staff. There just needs to be somebody within the local government that serves as my point of contact. So when I'm sending out announcements, emails, that sort of thing, I have one person that I'm contacting. But it's also possible to have a second person, maybe on the commission that is a secondary point of contact there. So benefits, you as a CLG get a close working relationship and greater technical assistance from our office. Your local government then would get to comment on properties that would be proposed for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. The National Park Service really likes getting comments from the CLGs on properties that might be listed in their local communities. And it's easier, you have an easier time commenting on those Section 106 projects, and that's anytime there's federal funding, permitting, or licensing on a project. Our office comments on it, but as a CLG, we'll make sure that you get copies of those projects so you can comment and see that yes, we approve of this, or no, maybe we want modifications, that sort of thing. We've already talked about the Nebraska Historic Tax Credit and Valuation Incentive Program. And it also helps establish what historic resources in whatever the government is, if it's a village, city, or county, are most important and worthy of preservation. So, where do we want to, expend our energy and resources, saving? Because we realize you can't save everything. So what are the most important resources that you do want to save and protect potentially? It helps with long range planning, disaster planning, and economic development activities. So, if your area is maybe prone to, a lot of flooding, what are the historic resources that are most important to protect and try to save? And we can help with, the program, and our office can help with flood adaptation to buildings. And then we also have annual subgrants. And then I'll talk about eligible grant activities. So our office gets funding from the National Park Service to run our programs on a statewide level. But within that funding, we subgrant at least 10% of that funding to our CLGs every year so they can operate their preservation programs on a local level. So in FY24, that ended up being, we had a little over $100,000 to subgrant, but we also realized preservation happens best at the local level. You know what resources are important to you and which ones you want to, help promote and save. So we will, subgrant more than 10%. So we have, subgranted, 130,000, 120,000, some years. So hiring consultants to do survey is an eligible expense, doing some sort of preservation planning, and integrating historic preservation into local government's comprehensive planning. A comprehensive plan is required if your jurisdiction has zoning. So that can be a powerful tool for zoning and zoning layers. Preparing National Register or local landmark nominations, this is a big popular one, especially with museums, public education. So walking tours, and whether that's just a brochure based or something with QR codes or an audio tour online, that sort of thing. Developing a podcast, bringing in speakers, there's all sorts of different possibilities. Public education in your local schools. You can develop design guidelines for your, downtown area or neighborhoods, and they don't have to be real specific. They can be fairly general. Feasibility studies for how to best use buildings in your community. Maybe there's, some vacant buildings and you're just trying to find the best use for them. We can help with those, with feasibility studies with historic buildings, developing a preservation handbook of how you do preservation in your community, sending the local government staff and commission members to trainings or bringing trainings into them. We can send you to conferences, even national conferences, or we can bring in experts to train you. Maybe there's a fee for a webinar, we can help pay for those. Building rehabilitation is an allowable expenditure, but the building must be listed in the National Register, and it must be publicly or nonprofit owned. So, some of your museum buildings, it will have a 5-year preservation easement put in place on it. But I will say, while this is an eligible expenditure, it's not a priority project for us because we don't have unlimited funding, and a lot of rehabilitation projects are quite expensive, and we need to spread out this CLG grant funding to CLGs across the state and not give everything just to one community. But if there's something small we can help with, would be happy to look at a grant application for that. So ineligible grant activities, reconstructing or moving or acquiring, so we can't help a museum, move a historic building into, your, museum grounds. We can't help you, buy a building from, another property owner. We can't pay for plans and specs for individual properties. Typically, there are some limited circumstances where we would allow it. So if it's, a museum building or the community library, a building that serves a community purpose, that is something we can help with. And that would be, hiring an architect to draw up some, basic plans. But we will allow that type of work for a group of buildings, and it's not just one property owner or private property owner it would benefit. We can't, just like the tax credits, we can't pay for landscaping, lighting outside a building, banners, historic markers, that sort of thing. We can't pay for collections, conservation, or curatorial work, or just maintaining historic properties or constructing new buildings. And we can't help establish any sort of cash reserves or fundraising. So some examples of projects in Nebraska: we've been able to fund National Register nominations, GIS development, preservation handbooks, design guidelines. There's this really fun walking tour in Sydney, feasibility studies, adaptive reuse studies, that sort of thing. So, and then other benefits, and I'll hand it back to Michael.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. So when we talk about preservation, and I know a lot of you guys probably have a passion for history, and you are probably dealing with people that typically have a passion for history, but something we certainly want to share is just that when we start talking about preservation, we oftentimes want to make sure that people do see it as an economic development tool, because preservation certainly has a lot of ties within our community, whether that's just trying to fix up buildings, but beyond that. So a lot of you guys are involved in what we would call heritage tourism. And there's no doubt that heritage tourism works best in places that feel authentic, that have that historic character and things along those lines. And so we certainly know that heritage tourism is alive and well in Nebraska. We certainly would love to be a part of that effort to make this more a part of our communities. And as Kelly was saying, preservation works best when it's really being activated by the local community. And so the more things we can do to really recognize our historic assets within communities as truly that, whether that's markers, it's national designation, it's those walking tours, other different things, just having them being bright and shiny parts of our community where they're not dealing with as much dilapidation as best we can, then that's something we want to see. We'll go and go to our next slide. And then one of the big things about preservation, and really even that economic development aspect that's oftentimes overlooked, is just community identity. Again, we all really just, I don't know, a lot of times humans are just attracted to places that have a unique feel, that really creates that sense of place, that sense of community. And I think we all recognize that your history, those stories, plus that architecture, all of that combined really does tell the story of your community and just how it's been developed and makes it unique. Even if you have similar types of buildings from one community to the other, there's stories behind that that do make different downtowns unique from each other, different residential areas unique from each other. And we hope that our tools will help leverage that unique identity for your community's needs as well. We're going to go to the next slide. And so, we hope that you guys will see preservation as part of the tools that you have within your communities, within your organizations. I'm sure a lot of you own historic properties, and so we hope that some of this information can be helpful to you. But certainly as you guys are leveraging those historic attributes of your communities, that preservation will be part of that. We are here to help. So if you would like to contact us, there's my contact information. There's also Kelly's there as well. We are a team of 9 individuals that serve the entire state. And so if there's some other areas of expertise, whether that's the National Register or historic markers or other things that we've got other individuals that can assist you with. We have our tax incentives coordinator as well. So take a look at our website. You can find us at the Nebraska State Historical Society. Under services, you'll find historic preservation, and hopefully be able to find a lot of details, but we're always happy to take your emails and your phone calls, and hope that this has been of assistance. So if anyone's got questions, I think we can take those now. And
Michael, did you want to talk about the funding threats too?
Oh, yes, thank you. And that's appreciate you mentioning that. So I'm sure as a lot of you guys have been dealing with, there's also been, as you've heard about some of the cuts to the museum world and to the arts and humanities world, we are currently facing some challenges on the historic preservation end. SHPOs, State Historic Preservation Offices, are typically funded at least 60%, or should say up to 60%, by funding that comes from the federal government and through the National Park Service. Funding for fiscal year 2025, which ends September 30th of 2025, has yet to be released. This has been causing several of our state historic preservation offices around the country, there are 57 of them because territories also have these, to start looking at laying off staff and certainly curtailing what we're able to do for programs. We've had a lot of people asking how that is impacting Nebraska. Right now, we have funding from the previous year that should be able to get us into the winter time. But after that, if they don't release this 25-year funding, we'll be in a pretty tight spot. And there's also been proposed threats to the fiscal year 26 funding. So obviously, we're not sure what that level of impact will be to us. Right now, we're planning on being here. We want to continue serving folks like you and the general public. But it has really required us to try to claw back some of our grant type programs. Any grants that we were going to be making available have certainly been put on pause and are suspended going forward, just because we're trying to ensure that we're able to offer our basic services before we can provide financial assistance to others. So that's just a little bit of the education piece. If there's things that you feel like you can add or do in those areas, just as there is across our industry, that's up to you. But just wanted to provide that little bit of information. If you'd like to learn more about the challenges that we're currently facing, the National Conference for State Historic Preservation Officers, they have a nice little website that talks a little bit more. And so do other resources such as the National Preservation Partners Network and many others of our national partners. And Kelly, you can probably mention a couple of those that have.
Well, the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions all have more information on their websites.
So feel free to take a look at that. But yes, so thank you for that reminder, Kelly. And then I guess, do you guys have any questions? I know a lot of this is going to be enjoyed by people on the recording. Obviously, they can contact us, but for you guys that are here in person, we're happy to take your questions.
I have a question about, is there an example of a preservation ordinance on your website, or can you maybe email us something? I'm trying to work on my local mayor, but if I have an example of what that preservation ordinance might say,
Yes. Yes.
that I
We-
can show
Yep.
them and it'll be easier.
Yep, I get this question each time I talk to a new community. We do have a model annotated ordinance. So it's a model ordinance, but then it's also annotated that explains, why certain language needs to be in it, or, where there's flexibility. And it can also email you the ordinances for the 11 CLGs in Nebraska, but I will put most emphasis on Neely, Crete, and Hebron because they are the ones who are certified most recently. And so, those ordinances are pretty good ones.
Okay.
So yep,
And
I can certainly email those to you,
Thanks.
Aaron.
And I will say that we do have, while we think that it's best if you have a historic preservation ordinance, you might as well also be a CLG. You can have a preservation ordinance outside of the CLG program, but it does need to still be approved by our office to be eligible for tax credits. We currently have 2 communities that are working on that, I guess I should say have those historic preservation ordinances. One is Ogallala, the other one's Ashland. Ogallala is considering becoming a CLG, so they're also pretty new as well. So it's expanding across the state.
Yeah, and there are also a few other communities like Fall City is working on it. I'm not sure if they've actually passed their ordinance yet. I don't think so. They've working on it. And there's communities like I actually want to say the city of Wahoo, and I'll have to look this up, might have an ordinance on the books, but they have never used it. I talked to them one time and they said, we've never used it, but like I said, I think it's Wahoo, but I'm not positive.
I wouldn't be surprised, but yeah. So our current mayor is really interested in history and he's not rerunning, next year. So I'm hoping that we can get something going, before he gets out of office, because who knows who the next person is going to be. So
Yeah, and I'll
but
look
yeah,
up
more
and see. Yeah, I'll look up and see if Wahoo does have an ordinance. Like I said, I can't quite remember right now.
But it can definitely get updated and modified to be ready to go. But yeah, reach out to Kelly. She can certainly share that detail with you. Any other questions? Well, Aaron, I guess since you're mentioning certified local governments, historic preservation ordinances, I know not every community, sometimes they get a little bit scared about, oh my, who's going to help provide that expertise and do that work. And several communities do sometimes contract out. Maybe it is with the local historical society or museum or like a Main Street community to provide kind of that muscle and that energy behind the ordinance. But it still needs to, come out of the city. It still needs to be official government. But as Kelly was saying, that board can oftentimes, the members can oftentimes be local experts, but at the same time, they can also assign, you kind of contract it out and for lack of a better term, to an organization in town that can be doing most of the work as long as there's a government link in contact.
Right. Yeah. Like Michael said, Main Street or economic development or museums, that sort of thing. And one thing I didn't mention earlier that I should have. So I mentioned there have to be at least 5 commission members. Those commission members don't need to live within the jurisdiction of whatever, the unit. So we'll just use, Wahoo as an example. So if Wahoo becomes a CLG, the commission members don't all need to live in Wahoo. They just need to live within the area. And we don't define what the area is. So maybe, it would be Saunders County, but it could also be outside Saunders County. The members just need to have an interest and, knowledge of the history and preservation of Wahoo, in this example.
Hopefully some connection to your community if you're
Right, exactly.
Expert.
Property owner, or, maybe, has worked in the community for a long time and just knows the community. But yeah, there is no residency requirement for those commission members. Are there any other questions?
Well,
yeah, I'm gonna say if you don't have any now, feel free to reach out to us, later. That's fine. So, and I will say, we do manage a historic preservation listserv in our office, and so I'll post, news articles, or if we do find out there's, grant opportunities from somewhere, put, post that. People are welcome to post questions or, announcements, that sort of thing, items related to preservation. Members are able to post. If you're interested in joining that, feel free to email me and I will get you added to that list. Oh, and Michael actually just put the link to join the listserv in the chat there. And you are welcome, April. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. I don't know if Karen, there's like an outro that you normally do or not. I can't remember. That's what I thought. That's what I thought.
So I just want to thank everybody for coming to the June meeting. Just a reminder that the July meeting will be, oops, where am I? Sorry, I should have this pulled up. And then these are recorded and they'll be put on the NMA website and on our YouTube channel. So please check those out. All of the past ones are available on there, so it's a great resource for everybody. The July meeting is going to be on July 27th, and Micah Huyser from Prairie, the museum in Holdridge, is going to be talking about summer interns. So I think that one will be a really great one. And then in August, if you remember, at the conference, we had Hunter from High AI speak, and he's going to speak to us again in August. September is going to be school-led experiences with Katie Carr. And October is risk assessment with Liz Bouton. November is going to be administration, museum administration 2.0. Deb Arns is going to be is working on revising that book that I know many of you guys are familiar with. The original one was written by Lynn Ireland and was used
Hugh
in the
Genoways. Lynn Ireland and Hugh Genoways.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. I was trying to think of Hugh Genoways, who used to teach the museum studies classes at UNL. I know several people have been through that program. And then finally in December, we are going to be talking to John P. Woodward about crafting a successful breakout session for MPMA. And if anybody has any ideas or would like to give a program, I am looking for ideas for 2026. So I want to thank you guys all again. And, if you do have any questions for Kelly or Michael, feel free to email them. Thank you guys again for all coming in and taking time to learn something. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Bye.